name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls. O God. Last week we were paralleling our approach to the fall with our approach to creation. As we approach creation, we started with Christ and his incarnation, which changes, of course, our understanding of the nature of creation and the nature of the human creature. If we approach the fall, we need to also start with another dimension of Christ's life, and what we said that was last week was his theophany. Theophany, so much about theophany parallels the story of creation and the fall, and the consequences of theophany and the consequences of the fall are sort of opposites of each other. So it's helpful for us in looking at the fall to actually start by looking at theophany in a paradoxical way. By seeing what Christ is undoing, we can better understand what happened in the fall in a biblical sense. If in creation we're asking what kind of creature are we and what kind of world do we live in the fall we're asking the simple question, what's wrong with us? Why doesn't life work the way that it should in many instances? And why do we need salvation? What do we need saved from? All those questions become hugely, hugely significant. And remember that last week we were really talking about the water of theophany. And Frank asked a very interesting question regarding if the water isn't sanctified until Christ is baptized, then what function did it play with St. John the Baptist and the sanctification that came through the baptism of John? And what we said, and I think I just want to return to that for a moment and reiterate that John's baptism stood in a line of baptismal practices, precursors to the fullness of baptism in the name of the Trinity throughout the history of Israel's life. Water is a purifying element. And the question really had to do with if spiritual darkness, if spiritual forces of wickedness tend to hide themselves in the water. And this is very much reflected in the prayers of the blessing of water at theophany, the prayers of the blessing of the water at baptism. Then what's happening with those spirits before they're really cast out by Christ's baptism? And the point we made was this: number one, that in any kind of ritual use of water, there are prayers which purify the water temporarily. What Christ is doing is a more significant event. And what we can say is that water purifies the body. Something wrong? Okay, thank you. Water purifies the body. Interestingly, when we look at John's baptism, there's two forms of purification going on there. People are coming to be baptized for the repentance and forgiveness of sins, but they're also confessing their sins. So you don't approach John's baptism and say, well, I'm going to hold on to my sins. You're going there for purification. And so you confess your sins, and that purifies the interior, the inward space. And you receive the baptismal, or not the baptismal, but the baptism of John, the washing in the waters of Jordan, purifies the exterior of the body. But the main significance of Christ's baptism is that if water washes our body, what we say in Christ's baptism is that his body washes the water. Okay? His body washes the water. It purifies, it sanctifies the water, and then that water spreads out and moves out into all creation and makes everything participate in the sanctification of the human body. And this begins to evoke then a lot of what we've talked about last fall was the role of the human person in bringing order and life and meaning and beauty to the rest of creation. From Christ's baptism, the waters of the Jordan flow outward and they go into, now technically they flow into the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on earth, but they then evaporate and they go into all the world. Where else, thinking of last fall when we were talking about creation, what's another example of water flowing outward? Anyone think of what I'm thinking of here? Just in the story of Genesis, the story of creation, right? Water is flowing out and is now blessed by Christ entering the water. It parallels the waters of paradise flowing out and forming the basis of the four rivers. Okay? Remember that? There's four rivers that flow from paradise. And as we emphasized, that doesn't mean when you look at those four rivers, we know that they don't all have the same common source. Ancient people knew that they don't have the same common source, but all four rivers were associated with great civilizations. All right, so I'm repeating what we talked about last fall, but all four rivers are associated with the emergence of civilization. So water flows out from paradise and waters civilization. Civilization is the flowering of the worship of God. The problem, of course, is, as we'll see, civilizations get founded on false worship, and the very heart of the fall, indeed, is false worship and false communion. We're going to get to that probably next week, the essence of the fall. But the point I want to just make here is that the water flows from the baptism of Christ out into creation. The water flows from paradise out into the world. If that water, if those rivers are associated with civilization, then the waters of theophany also parallel that and begin to bring life and meaning and purpose and reintegration to the rest of creation. We're beginning to undo what was done in the tragedy of the fall through the baptism of Christ. Any questions about that? This is just, returning to where we started last week. So when what I want to do now is explain the temptations of Christ a little bit, but I also want to explain them within a certain context. And I'm very tempted to just read extensively from this book, which I will take a moment to mention. It's called The Way, not to be confused with Metropolitan Callistos' The Way, an introduction to the Orthodox faith. It's really not an introduction, if anyone's interested in this book. I think you'd have to have maybe a classics degree to call this an introduction. It's pretty deep stuff. It's not exactly like starting from nothing. I'm not sure who he had in mind that it would be an introduction for, but it's a marvelous, marvelous book. It's by Father Proto-Presbyter George Metilianos. I don't know if my Greek is okay there, Metilianos. Really, really remarkable book. And I haven't returned to this book in many years, but I was reading through it the other day in preparation for some things, and I'm like, wow, somehow what we've been saying this whole year is like what he was saying in here. So sometimes maybe you read something and it stays within you more than you realize. I do want to read a little bit from what he writes here, because he's building up into the meaning of creation into the fall. The created world, although very good, in Genesis 1:31, was made in a potential state, a motion towards a particular end, which can only be fulfilled within the sphere of communion with God. Right? Creation was made in a potential state, a motion towards a particular end. Remember when we talked about last before Christmas, I guess. I don't know what to call last. Wasn't fall, beginning of winter. That even in creation, even in the creation story, the human person is given a mission. We're given a mission. Mission doesn't start after the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ and Pentecost. That's not when mission starts. Mission starts from the very beginning, all right? And that's what he's capturing here. we're in a potential state, but we're meant to be in motion towards a particular end, which is only fulfilled within the sphere of communion with God. So pay attention to that, because if the only thing that fulfills our potential state and realizes our mission is communion with God, then we really are going to see that in the fall, what the fall really is a rejection of communion with God, or at the very least, an entering into communion with the false spirit without realizing to some degree how much that constituted a rejection of the communion with God. God is king and Lord over irrational creation. Thus was man ordained by the Creator to be that he should lead creation and himself to the perfection foreordained by the Creator, to transcend createdness and unite with God. That's our mission, to transcend createdness and unite with God. Man's job was supposed to be maintain this communion of the created with the uncreated. And so again, that's our mission. Our mission is to have a relationship to the rest of creation from the context of paradise, in which the beauty and grace of paradise through us flows into all of creation. And as priests of the creation, we take up creation, we offer it to God as communion, we receive it, and all is sanctified. And so again, that's what we see happening in theophany, the sanctification of creation, the sanctification of our homes, the sanctification of our bodies, and throughout the church year, the blessing and sanctification of all the different elements and dimensions of creation. That is inherent to our mission even before the fall. Now, here we're going to get into something very interesting, and he's quoting St. Maximus the Confessor, and you kind of see this. This is a very famous thing that St. Maximus the Confessor teaches regarding this mission and what it means to go out and to take creation and unite it to ourselves in communion with God. Okay? That's the context here. According to St. Maximus the Confessor, with the creation of the world, 5 divisions are affected. 5 divisions are affected. That of or between uncreated and created. I'm going to go through all of these. So I'm going to list them all and then we'll talk about each one. Uncreated and created, intelligible and perceptible, heaven and earth, paradise and the inhabited world, male and female. 5 divisions are affected as an act of creation itself. These are not divisions that are created after the fall. This is very, very important. This is also, and this kind of will lead us up into Adam and Eve's relationship in the garden, which we'll be talking about next week. In terms of the male and female, and the division of the whole human person into a male-female entity meant to be in a relationship. So 5 divisions. Let's just go through each one. That of the uncreated and the created. So this is the fundamental division of creation itself. God is uncreated. He is, in this sense, in his essence, utterly transcendent, and there's nothing like him. And we really don't know his nature. We don't know his essence. That is beyond our capacity because we are created. He is uncreated, okay? So that's the essential division of creation itself, that God creates an other, okay? A real other that is an expression of his love, but is not simply a replication of himself. He is uncreated, we are created. And that language emphasizes that there's a division, there's a gulf between us. But that's a gulf that's meant to be overcome. It's not a gulf that's created to be saying, hey, now stay in your lane, okay? That's not the origin of that. That's not the meaning of that. It's simply that between the creator and the creature, there is a distance. There's this marvelous quote that he makes in here, and I want to share it with you because it's just so good. The distance between maker and creature, or uncreated and created, is not spatial, but ontological. Let me say that again. The distance between maker and creature is not spatial, but ontological. They are two completely different things. God is the wholly other. Okay? So with creation, there comes into existence a being that is absolutely foreign to the uncreated in essence. And here he quotes John of Damascus, not in place, but in nature. The distance between maker and creature is not spatial, but ontological. Now think about that for a moment, because this is really interesting. What St. John of Damascus is saying, what our author is saying here, is that the distance between us and God is not that he's far off somewhere spatially, and we're here, and some great distance of space separates us. That's how I think we, because of our worldview, we tend to think of God that way. Where is he? He's up in heaven. Well, if he's up in heaven, that means he must be very far away spatially. He's not far away spatially. In fact, Christ is in our midst. He is and always will be. We say that all the time. What does that mean? That he is not distant from us spatially. He's right here. He's right in this room with us. He is present with us always. Why don't we see him then? Because his distance is ontological. And in itself, we cannot perceive his beingness with our own, especially in our own fallen state. We are limited in our capacity to perceive him, but that doesn't mean he's not here. He is not distant spatially. He is distant ontologically. There's something wrong with us, and therefore, though he is right here in our midst, we don't even notice his presence. And we've noticed, in many ways, this is not something that's alien to our experience. How many of you have had this? And I'm sure this is universal. You learn something new. I should think of an example here. I don't know. This is a really dumb one. Okay, I'll think of an example here. It's a really dumb example, but it's kind of along the same lines because it's in the mundane. When I was a kid growing up, I had never seen or heard of asparagus. Like my mother never made it for dinner. I never saw it, I never saw it in a menu. I just have no memory, absolutely no memory of really even the existence of asparagus. Probably until I went to college and I saw people eating asparagus. And I was like, what is that? And once I knew what asparagus was, suddenly it was everywhere, And that's the phenomenon I'm describing here. When something doesn't lie within your perceptibility, you don't even notice it. And it can be right in front of you, but you don't know that it's there. Same thing happened with nachos. Cheese nachos. When I was a kid, never heard of nachos. Went with a friend to the wave pool out in Settler's Cabin. You all been to the wave pool in Settler's Cabin? It hasn't changed. I was going there in the 70s and early 80s. I went back, maybe we were visiting Pittsburgh, and I said to my kids, we got to go to the wave pool, all right? It's still open. We went back to the wave pool. It had not changed at all. It was exactly the same 30, 40 years later, whatever it was. But anyway, we went to the wave pool, and my friend goes, let's go get nachos. I'm like, nachos? What is that? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he goes up and he gets these chips and this cheese, and he's like, try one. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And suddenly I realized the whole world knew about nachos. I was the one who didn't know about nachos. All right, so something was like, I didn't see something that was common simply because I wasn't aware of it, even though it was probably all around me all the time. I probably could have gone to a Pirates game or a Steelers game and ordered nachos. I just didn't even see it on the menu, right? So there's a phenomenon that when we are not aware of something and we are not capable of turning our attention to something that's present, we literally don't see it. We don't even recognize it's there. And here's the whole thing with God and our blindness, and we'll see this picked up a little bit in the homily today. God is present, And if we are occupying ourselves with everything else as if he is irrelevant, we simply won't notice him. He is not distant spatially, but he is distant ontologically. And we have got to change ontologically, that's what baptism does, in order to perceive his presence. All right, so this is one of the distances, the two divisions that are affected in creation, uncreated and created. Intelligible and perceptible is the second one. And what does that mean? Well, perceptible means, and this is sort of along the same lines that we've just been talking, perceptible means things that we can see and hear and taste and touch, and through our senses, we can perceive their presence. Intelligible means that which is only spiritually discerned. So the intelligible powers are what? The angels. All right, the angels are intelligible powers. The intelligible and the perceptible have to do with this idea that there are things that can be perceived through the created senses, but there are other things that cannot be perceived precisely that way. They require a different organ of perception, which we'll be talking about as well very extensively, and we've talked about it a little bit last year, but that's the nous, N-O-U-S, the noetic faculty, which is the heart and the eye of the soul, is what we use to apprehend intelligible realities. All right, so that's another aspect. The invisible world and the visible world would be another very simple way of putting that. The invisible world and the visible world. They're both here, they're both present, but they require different organs to perceive. Heaven and earth is the next one. That should be obvious, although it's more subtle than we realize. In Hebrew, another way of saying heaven and earth in a way that would be absolutely accurate to their worldview is simply sky and land. Right? So we say heaven and earth, and we think, oh, heaven, that's where souls go when they leave the body. Heaven is a place where, angels are playing harps. Heaven is a place where it's out there and it's heavenly, and earth is where we live. But that's not precisely the biblical worldview. Heaven means the sky, the air, and earth means the land from which we came and in which we dwell. All right? So that is another division that's meant to be transcended. How does that which is earthly transcend the earth and become heavenly? Well, you've got to ascend, wouldn't you? You would have to be able to ascend in some ways. What is the human fascination with flight? Why do we want to go into outer space? There's nothing for us out there but death. But our entire imagination says, let's go to space. Let's use technology. Let's go see if we can live on Mars. Why do we want to do that? Because we were made to ascend. But we're not made to ascend simply deeper into the perceptible creation. We're made to ascend into the intelligible world, into the heavenly world, into the world of the uncreated, right? So there's another example of how we're going to understand the fall and our failure to understand our mission in doing all these things. These are the things that Christ will complete, is that we get confused. We want to fly because we want to ascend, but we want to ascend the right way, and instead we're interested in flying for other reasons. All right? And I'm not knocking flight. No pilots amongst, I've known many pilots, astronauts even. I went to school with a family that a friend of mine, his brother is a very famous astronaut. So I'm not knocking any of that. It's a fascinating field. It's just that the impulse comes from this division that was present there and affected at creation itself. And that is to take the earthly and the heavenly and to make them one. So in this sense, who's going to do that? Of course, Christ is going to do that. So another way of saying heaven and earth, paradise and the inhabited world. Now we're getting a little bit more specific. Paradise is part of, it's an intelligible dimension of the perceptible creation. Paradise is a garden into which a man is placed to begin his mission to spread its fragrance and to spread its beauty and its order and its meaning to the rest of creation. So paradise and the inhabited world, meaning the place where everything else lives. It's one of the interesting things about paradise is that animals don't live there in Genesis. When Adam goes to name the animals have to be brought to paradise, but they live outside of paradise. Well, the serpent, the serpent is, of course, an embodiment of spiritual evil, who is permitted to be there. And we'll get to that in the mystery of the story of the fall. And it's parallel to why is Satan permitted to tempt Christ in the desert? Why is Satan permitted to tempt Adam and Eve in the paradise garden? That's a great thing to think about. Okay, so paradise in the inhabited world, and then finally male and female. And I wanted to point out something I think very interesting about the male and the female. I suppose briefly, maybe we'll talk about it later, but if we think about male and female, it's obvious gosh, there's so many phrases we have, there's so many words we have for the battle of the sexes, if you will, right? We have many different ways of describing the tension that exists between male and female. And of course, we understand that love and matrimonial love is the resolving of the tension between male and female. How many stories are there of people, a man and a woman, a specific man and a woman, who maybe as young people, thought they hated each other, couldn't stand each other, couldn't stand the way the other breathed, and then they fall in love and they become soulmates and they're united. This dimension of divisibility between male and female, this sense that there's a separation there, there's a division there, which predates the fall. And again, this is very, very important. It becomes an expression of love and the potentiality of love. And that's what all of these divisions do. Starting with uncreated and created, God creates the world so that as an expression of his love, so that this world can be raised up in love and be in communion with him. And that division can be erased, not ontologically. So God is not distant spatially, but ontologically. The distance becomes erased, not ontologically, but love unites the opposites. And so we see this dimension of division and opposites baked into creation. And the meaning of all of that is, in fact, love. It's of completion and wholeness. So the interesting thing about male and female is that in the creation story, the human person is made as, and this is obvious, but maybe not so much, depending on how we read it, as a male-female unity. There's a male-female unity before Eve is differentiated from Adam, right? This is the meaning, we talked about this last year, but this is the meaning of this whole idea of Adam's rib, and Eve is taken from the body of Adam. What is that fundamentally saying? It means that before the division, Adam was a whole human person, and a whole human person is a male-female unity. That's what a whole human person is, you see. The purpose of separating out the male and the female is so that they can realize this mission that God gives and puts into the very dimension of creation itself, of moving towards the other in love. Because that's what he does towards us. That's what we're called to do towards him. And we are called, therefore, to affect that movement in love towards the other in all other things. And this is especially true in the human person itself, in the human nature itself. So Adam, before the separation into Adam and Eve, Adam is a male-female unity. And the division occurs so that love can be realized as a coming together. And this is the mystery of matrimony, that two become one. And this is not merely metaphorical language, right? Two become one in a very real and powerful way. And I'm about to get into some pretty deep things that I think we better wait for next week, but because we're running out of time here. But let me share an example of how much, and this is going to be a little strange, but how much two become one, not metaphorically, but really. I was reading an article in, there's a marvelous online newsletter called Aeon, A-E-A-O-N, I think is how it's spelled. Aeon meaning is sort of the Greek philosophy, the ages and everything. And the headline of the article, and this is pertinent to all of this, is we will never live on another planet than the planet Earth. We won't live on Mars, we won't live on Venus, we won't live on one of Jupiter's moons. We're not going to find another habitable Earth within so many light years and ever, ever, ever simply live there. And the argument they were making, has anyone else come across this? Can you guess the argument that they're making of why? I mean, imagine if merely 10 years away, we had the technology to travel, and merely 10 years away, there was an Earth, another Earth, with enough oxygen that we could breathe the atmosphere, and those were not issues. This article is saying we still would never be able to live there. It would kill us instantly. Can anyone guess why? Bacteria. Not bad bacteria, but the absence of the bacteria that lives within us. The argument that they've made is that the human body lives in an environment and is connected to that environment in ways that we do not think about a lot. COVID helped us think about this a little bit. When we get into a crowded restaurant or a crowded room, or even a crowded church maybe, but in any event, a crowded room, and we breathe, we're sharing the atmosphere. There is stuff going from me to you, and you're breathing it into your body. And you're breathing out, and I'm breathing into me what has been just in your body, and we're connected. And in fact, our entire biological life functions this way. Our bodies are filled with trillions of bacterial partners that allow us to eat food, that allow us to break down things and create energy physically that enables us to live, that allows our nervous system to function, our immune system to function, right? We're utterly dependent upon the microbiome that dwells within us, and that microbiome is unique in its particulars to Earth. This is why if you travel to other parts of the world and you can't eat the food, if you travel to parts of Africa and look at what the people there eat, and you simply tried to eat the same food, you would not be able to do it. Why? Because they live in a fundamentally different location, and their microbiome is sufficiently different from yours that they can digest that food and you cannot. Okay? So this is, even on our own planet, we experience the difficulties of this. We are very much connected to our environment and to our Earth. And I suspect that when two people get married, this phenomenon where two people, if they're married long enough, they begin to look similar to each other. You notice that? It's really true. It's not true for everybody by any means, but there are married couples that you could actually look at pictures of them when they were young. You're like, oh, that's fine. They don't look at all alike. But after 60 years of marriage, you look at them like, wow, they look really like the way they smile is similar and the way they laugh and their mannerisms, but even structurally, they've begun to look similar. And that's because when we get married to somebody and when we form a family, we are literally creating an environment which is unique to that family. And we have our own, I told you this is going to be weird, we have our own bacteria. We have our own little microbiome world that is familial even. Now, the difference between one family in Allison Park and another family in Allison Park is going to be minute, but we sense it. People's houses smell differently, don't they? Or that line in there's a movie, I won't mention it because it's a little bit charged, but someone says, oh, their house always smells like soup, you know? And it's one of those jokes, it's like, you get it, you know, but we smell differently. Families have a family smell. Dogs know this. Just ask your dog. And you can ask your dog in a lot of ways. They know exactly what the difference of smell is. That's because of these things. And so the argument of this article was that there is, without having been actually living in, even if you found another planet with life already there, with oxygen, it would kill us almost immediately to go there and to try to live there without extensive technology that would be so fragile that the moment it failed, you're dead. All right? It's a very interesting article, and has nothing to do with religion, has nothing to do even with philosophy. It's just a biological statement. We are connected to each other. Our oneness is quite literally physical with the earth, and the oneness of a husband and wife becomes quite literally physical, not only in the physical act of procreation, but in the sense that by living and sharing the same space, they begin to be defined within a very unique relationship to to each other and the rest of their environment. And should they have children, their children as well. So this is a very interesting thing when you think about the human vocation is to unite opposites by entering into them and drawing them to themselves. That's what we do already, right? Getting back to COVID again, think about that the next time you go to a restaurant, that everybody is basically swapping spit. I'm sorry, but it's true. It's true. We're breathing vapor that was in me, and then you breathe it in, and now it's in you. Right? You have an immune system, so it's not a problem. If you don't have an immune system, it is a problem. And every now and then you hear people that, you know, oh gosh, I'm thinking of Seinfeld now, but the bubble boy, right? But people whose immune compromise is so significant that they have to actually live separate because they can't even breathe in the same space as another person. It's the same idea, you see. So we're connected in ways that we can't see. And COVID helped really magnify that whole idea. Whether or not masks were effective or not effective or political or not political, that's irrelevant. The reality, however, is that we already do this. All right, we need to stop there. But I'm going to continue on this and talk a little bit about, here's a small assignment for next week, to think about the icon of the deesis. I'm not going to tell you what that is. Try to find, if you don't know what it is, the icon that's known as the deesis. We're going to talk about that in relationship to the uniting of male and female as we then begin to look at Adam and Eve's relationship and the nature of the fall as the breaking of communion by entering into communion with a false spirit. Okay? Thank you all.